Dr. Fauci's NIH division, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, funded a series of horrific experiments on beagle puppies between 2016 and 2020. One of the most graphic studies involved dogs placed in mesh cages while sandflies were allowed to bite and feed on their heads, allegedly to study how certain parasites are transmitted in hopes of improving treatments for parasitic infections affecting humans. Some dogs were reportedly devocalized to prevent barking and were euthanized at the end of the studies. While Fauci wasn't personally conducting the tests, his agency approved the funding of about $375,000 for the research. Critics, including lawmakers and animal rights groups, condemned the studies as unnecessarily cruel and accused the NIH of lacking transparency and ethical oversight in approving such horrific procedures. The incident sparked widespread outrage online, with many calling for Dr. Fauci to be held responsible for the funding decisions made under his leadership. Morbid Facts, Part 208. Just last month, Sheldon Johnson went on the Joe Rogan Experience to tell the story of how he turned his life around after serving 25 years in prison for a minor offense. The same guy was arrested earlier this week for allegedly murdering a man and storing his head in the freezer. In 2017, a group of Maryland college students consumed so much alcohol at a house party that the air in the house registered a reading of .01 on a breathalyzer. In 2003, two Australian teens spent 22 hours in a tree above rising floodwaters after a crocodile killed their friend and showed off the boy's body to them. The 13-foot croc then stalked them in the tree all night long until a helicopter finally rescued them the next day. In 1968 Vietnam, Marines William Cox and James Hollingsworth met in a bunker where they vowed to reconnect every New Year's Eve if they survived. The tradition persisted for an incredible 5 decades until Sergeant Hollingsworth sadly passed away. This photo shows Sergeant Cox faithfully standing guard for his comrade one last time. Morbid Facts, Part 551. In 2012, tragedy struck when 30-year-old newlywed Maria Pantazopoulos was having some trash-the-dress photos taken in Montreal while wearing her wedding dress. She was only standing in about a foot of water on a river when her gown became waterlogged, quickly pulling her deeper and deeper underwater as her dress suddenly weighed up to 100 pounds. The photographer did everything he could to save her before Maria cried out, "I can't anymore, it's too heavy," and then she let go. Her body was recovered by a scuba diver 2 hours later. In 2008, a college student from Belgium decided to heat up some leftover spaghetti that had been sitting out on the kitchen counter for 5 days. He told his parents that it tasted strange, but figured it was the new tomato sauce that he added to the pasta. After eating the entire bowl, he headed out to play some soccer but had to return home 30 minutes later while suffering from severe abdominal pains, headaches, and nausea. He then vomited for several hours before finally managing to fall asleep, but he never woke up. The man's lifeless body was discovered the next morning after he died from an extreme form of food poisoning known as Bacillus cereus, aka fried rice syndrome. Coach Tyler Wall was a 38-year-old fitness mentor who played a central role in MrBeast's recent video, Lose 100 Pounds, Win $250,000, where he trained contestant Maj in a grueling months-long weight loss journey. Tyler provided constant support physically and emotionally as Maj fought to shed over 100 pounds. But tragically, midway through filming, Coach Wall was found dead in his Greenville, North Carolina apartment on February 18, 2025. His death was described as sudden and unexpected, with no official cause publicly disclosed. Completely devastated, the MrBeast team gave Maj the choice to stop the challenge, but he chose to continue in honor of his late coach. Maj ultimately completed the drastic transformation, dropping from 324 pounds to 222, achieving the goal he and his coach set out to reach together. Despite initial hesitation, the MrBeast team chose to release the video with a tribute honoring Tyler's impact, ending with the words, "In loving memory of Coach Tyler Wall." Morbid Facts, Part 650. There were countless serious warning signs leading up to the implosion of the OceanGate Titan submersible. Experts repeatedly flagged the vessel's experimental design, particularly its carbon fiber hull, which is prone to microscopic weaknesses under deep-sea pressure. Former OceanGate employees raised alarms about structural integrity, previous dive malfunctions, the fact that the sub's navigation system relied on a modded Xbox controller, and over 100 documented equipment issues, including a 2022 incident where passengers heard alarming cracking sounds as the pressure increased. But despite this, OceanGate CEO Stockton Rush pushed forward, publicly dismissing regulation as a barrier to innovation. In fact, the warning signs were so clearly numerous that after the implosion, many have speculated that Rush may have even had suicidal intentions, citing his repeated disregard for safety warnings and his presence on board during the fatal dive, though no evidence has officially confirmed this theory. Morbid Facts, Part 381. When she was a child, Oprah Winfrey's family was so poor that she had to wear dresses made out of potato sacks to school. She was molested several times by her own family members and got pregnant by the age of 14 after running away from home. Oprah was apparently in so much shame at the time that she never even named her son, who was born prematurely and died shortly after birth. Squeezing a man's nuts very tightly can have roughly the same effect as using an EpiPen. But it may also kill them in the process because squeezing someone's balls hard enough can raise their adrenaline to dangerous levels. This video shows the brainwaves of a man experiencing an epileptic seizure. Seizures can have many different causes that result in a burst of uncontrolled electrical activity in the brain. Many times the patient loses consciousness, but otherwise they may experience strong tingling, anxiety, or déjà vu. Decades of intense drumming took a brutal toll on Phil Collins's body, causing such severe nerve damage that he can no longer hold onto drumsticks. After spinal surgery in 2009, Collins lost much of the feeling in his hands and was forced to give up drumming entirely. The loss devastated him to the point where he contemplated taking his own life. In 1974, Stanford student Arliss Perry was found murdered in a campus chapel, posed kneeling at the altar with a candle stuck inside her body in what appeared to be a ritualistic killing. The case went cold for decades until in 2018, DNA linked it to a campus security guard who took his own life as police attempted to arrest him. In 2021, during a wedding ceremony in Uttar Pradesh, India, a bride named Sarabi collapsed from a heart attack and was pronounced dead shortly afterwards. But instead of canceling the expensive event, both families agreed to continue the wedding by marrying the groom to Sarabi's younger sister, Nisha. The ceremony went on while Sarabi's body was placed in another room in the house. The incident shocked many and was confirmed by local news and relatives, who watched in total disbelief as a wedding and funeral unfolded under the same roof. Morbid Facts, Part 647. Mark Hoffman was a skilled forger who gained notoriety in 1980s Utah by selling fake historical documents, many of which targeted early Mormon history. His most infamous creation, the Salamander Letter, falsely claimed that Joseph Smith's divine revelations involved a magical salamander, casting the origins of the Latter-day Saints Church in a bizarre and controversial light. Hoffman sold these forgeries for tens of thousands of dollars, duping collectors, historians, and even high-ranking church officials. But as demand grew, he began accepting payments for documents he hadn't yet forged, falling deep into debt. When clients started questioning delays in authenticity, Hoffman resorted to violence, killing 2 people with homemade bombs before accidentally injuring himself while attempting to plant a third. Although mangled, he survived and later pled guilty to murder and fraud. Now 70 years old, he's been in prison since 1987 and will likely remain there for the rest of his life. Morbid Facts, Part 535. In 1966, James Meredith, the first black man to attend the University of Mississippi, planned a one-man, 220-mile march against fear to encourage black people to vote. But despite a police presence just 2 days into the march, James was shot in the neck, back, and head by a white supremacist. He was quickly rushed to the hospital and ended up surviving his wounds, while his attacker only received 2 years in prison. Later that same year, James completed the march, by which point over 10,000 people had joined him. James is now 91 and still lives in Mississippi. Depression-era gangster John Dillinger survived a shootout with the FBI, robbed 24 banks and 4 police stations, had plastic surgery to change his face and remove his fingerprints, escaped from prison using a wooden gun, and led the government on a year-long chase that cost them 4 times the amount he had ever stolen. After Dillinger was finally shot and killed by the FBI in 1934, bystanders rushed to the theater where he was killed to soak their handkerchiefs in his blood, while thousands stormed Chicago's morgue to have their photos taken with his corpse. Known online as Pioneers Productions, Randy Stair became obsessed with the cartoon Danny Phantom and was convinced that he'd be reincarnated as a character on the show named Ember. While working a night shift at a grocery store in Pennsylvania, he blocked all the exits, pulled out 2 shotguns, and murdered 3 coworkers before turning the gun on himself in the frozen foods aisle. Police later uncovered a trove of videos and writings outlining his delusions and plans, in which he explained his belief that these murders would allow him to cross over into the animated world of Danny Phantom. During a morning broadcast in 1974, Florida news reporter Christine Chubbuck calmly announced, "In keeping with Channel 40's policy of bringing you the latest in blood and guts, you're going to see another first, attempted suicide." She then proceeded to take her own life on live TV. Many viewers and even people in the control room assumed it was a scripted segment or a special effects stunt. Christine had reportedly long struggled with depression, loneliness, and frustration over the channel's focus on violent topics and sensationalism. Her death completely shocked the nation and remains one of the most disturbing moments in broadcast history. Morbid Facts, Part 148. In 2018, 18-year-old Cameron Herron was street racing against his friend before crashing his Mustang into a mother and toddler, killing them both. Here's his reaction to his sentencing of 24 years when he only expected a maximum of 10.
Court's going to adjudicate the defendant guilty, sentence him to 9 years in the Florida State Prison. On count 2, same charge, court will adjudicate the defendant guilty, sentence him to 15 years Florida State Prison, and that'll run consecutive to count 1, for a total 24 years Florida State Prison.
Nevada's Clown Motel shares its land with an abandoned cemetery, where most of the 300 people buried there either died in a mine fire or from a 1902 plague. In the year 2000, all 4 members of the Sedagaya family were stabbed and murdered in their own home. Afterwards, the killer remained in their house for several hours, eating their food, using their toilet without flushing, logging into the family computer, and even taking a nap on their couch. But despite an extensive effort, the killer was never identified. Morbid Olympic Facts, Part 1. After winning 4 gold and 2 silver medals in the 2012 Olympics, making him the most successful Olympic athlete in history, Michael Phelps became deeply depressed. He felt as though his sense of purpose had been completed, and was consumed with so much emptiness that he contemplated taking his own life. Uday Hussein, the son of Saddam, was named chairman of the Iraqi Olympic Committee in 1984. Athletes who disappointed him were subject to torture and imprisonment after the games. Kelvin Kiptum is the current world record holder for the men's marathon, but sadly passed away earlier this year after driving his car into a tree. If he hadn't been killed, he likely would have become the first person to run an official marathon in under 2 hours. Security guard Richard Jewell saved hundreds of lives by spotting a bomb and alerting police at the 1996 Olympics. He was later wrongly accused of the crime and spent months enduring media slander despite being a hero. The FBI thoroughly searched his home multiple times and maintained 24-hour surveillance of him before Eric Rudolph confessed to the crime. Before becoming one of boxing's most infamous promoters, Don King was no stranger to violence. In 1954, he shot and killed a man who was allegedly trying to rob one of King's gambling operations. The killing was ruled self-defense and King walked free. But in 1966, he was involved in a far more brutal incident, stomping a man to death over a $600 gambling debt. He was convicted of manslaughter and served only 4 years in prison. After his release, King quickly climbed the ranks of the pro boxing world, building a multi-million-dollar empire despite the bodies he left behind. In 2001, an elderly Japanese man named Tatsuo Osako passed away quietly at the age of 88. It wasn't until after his death that people discovered he had helped over 2,000 Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution during World War II by quietly stamping their travel documents and sheep-herding them onto ships bound for safety. He never spoke of his actions, kept no accolades, and lived a modest life as a travel agent. His family only found out that he'd secretly saved thousands of lives after discovering old photos and records that were tucked away in his home. Morbid Facts, Part 644. Tara Correa McMullen was a rising young actress best known for playing a gang-affiliated teen on Judging Amy. But in a cruel twist of fate, her real life began to mirror her on-screen role. At just 16, she started dating a 26-year-old member of the Crips and moved into gang territory in Inglewood, California. In 2005, she was gunned down outside of her apartment in a gang-related shooting, struck multiple times and left to die on the sidewalk. The man who killed her was later sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without parole. In 2011, 48-year-old New Zealand truck driver Stephen McCormick slipped between the cab and trailer of his truck and landed ass first onto a compressed air hose. The metal nozzle pierced his left cheek and began blasting air into his body at around 100 psi. But instead of entering his bloodstream, which would have killed him instantly, the air forced its way beneath his skin, inflating him like a balloon and separating his fat from muscle tissue. His body swelled rapidly while his skin became dangerously tight as paramedics rushed him to the hospital. Doctors managed to relieve the pressure and stabilize him, and against all odds, McCormick survived the freak accident without any permanent damage. Morbid Facts, Part 547. Just last year, a 23-year-old man died from a catastrophic spinal injury while playing at a Topgolf with some friends. In what was described as a prank gone wrong, his drunken friends had pushed him off the platform, causing him to miss the safety netting and fall 12 feet directly onto his head. In 1990, a flight heading from Medellin, Colombia to New York City crashed onto a hillside after running out of fuel, killing nearly half of the passengers on board. While being treated for serious injuries, 2 of the male passengers were arrested when ER doctors found baggies of cocaine that they'd swallowed and attempted to smuggle. Both men were sentenced to 6 years to life in prison. The British Pet Massacre was a week-long event in 1939, during which an estimated 400,000 cats and dogs, 1/4 of England's pet population, were killed out of fear of them eventually being gassed or left behind during an evacuation. Almost immediately afterwards, the event was recognized as completely unnecessary, stemming from social panic from the impending war and people seeking a way to feel like they were contributing to the war effort. None of the fears that led to the massacre actually ended up materializing. Elizabeth Holmes founded the company Theranos in 2003, claiming her device could run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood. At its peak, the company was valued at $9 billion, but it was all an elaborate lie. The technology never worked, test results endangered patients, and Holmes was convicted of fraud in one of the biggest corporate scandals of modern times. In 2023, she was sentenced to 11 years in prison. In the 1990s, Nigerian conman Emmanuel Nwudi scammed a massive Brazilian bank out of $242 million by selling them a Nigerian airport that never existed. Posing as a top banking official, he used forged documents and fake phone calls to convince executives they were funding an incredible deal. The fraud ran for years before auditors finally exposed it. Woody was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but much of the money was never recovered. Tanya Head became president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network after gaining fame for her harrowing survival story. She claimed to have barely escaped the collapse of the South Tower, suffering third-degree burns while crawling through smoke and flames, while watching several colleagues die around her, including her own fiancé, whose body was never recovered. She led tours of Ground Zero for grieving families, gave emotional public speeches, and became an inspiring face of 9/11 remembrance. But in 2007, it was finally exposed that she wasn't even in America on 9/11. Her entire story, right down to the dead fiancé, was all an elaborate lie. The Biggest Frauds of All Time, Part 2. Milli Vanilli became global pop stars in the late 80s, winning a Grammy with hits like Girl You Know It's True. But in 1990, it was exposed that the duo had never sung a single note on their own records or during live shows. They were always lip-syncing to tracks recorded by studio singers. Their Grammy was revoked, albums were pulled from stores, and the scandal became one of the most infamous frauds in music history. Belle Gibson built a global wellness brand by claiming she had cured her terminal brain cancer through diet and natural remedies. But in 2015, journalists revealed she never actually had cancer at all and also lied about donating to charity. The scam made her millions but ended in total disgrace. She was fined 400,000 Australian dollars for misleading customers, and her wellness empire completely collapsed. In the early 2000s, Rudy Kurniawan became one of the world's top rare wine sellers, moving millions of dollars worth of supposedly priceless bottles to elite collectors. But behind the scenes, he was running the biggest wine fraud in modern history. Rudy refilled bottles with cheap blends, forged labels, and even used UV light to adjust his fakes so that they'd fool collectors' authentication tools. In 2012, the FBI raided his home and found an entire wine forgery lab, stacks of empty bottles, fake labels, corking machines, and a massive stockpile of cheap wine. In 2014, Rudy was sentenced to 10 years in prison in order to repay all $28.4 million. But to this day, some of his fakes are still sitting undiscovered in the world's finest wine collections. In 2021, 16-year-old Kennedy Littledyke was ejected from her car during a high-speed crash in Idaho, miraculously landing on a 30-foot high power line dangling upside down by her now broken leg. The pressure from the wire pinched her femoral artery, preventing her from bleeding out, while an electrical burn cauterized another wound in her neck. She hung there for about an hour until rescuers finally cut the power and freed her. Despite having 21 surgeries and losing her leg, Kennedy miraculously survived and now shares her story and journey to recovery to inspire others online. In 2020, 16-year-old promising soccer player Alexander Gomez was tragically shot and killed by police in Mexico after officers allegedly mistook him for a criminal when he was riding his motorcycle to buy a soda. The killing sparked national outrage and drew attention to police violence in Mexico. At the boy's funeral, his teammates honored him by placing his coffin in front of a goalpost and gently kicking a soccer ball against it to score his final goal, a moving tribute to a life full of promise that was cut tragically short. Morbid Facts, Part 642. In 2008, Mark Ruffalo's younger brother Scott, a well-known Beverly Hills hairstylist, was found slumped on his bathroom floor with a single execution-style gunshot wound to the back of his head. He died a week later as police called it a targeted killing and questioned 2 individuals who were ultimately not charged. Today, Scott's death still remains an unsolved Hollywood mystery, a wound his older brother Mark still carries. Mark later said, "You never get over it, you just get used to it." In 2008, a 7-year-old boy from India named Akrid Jaswal performed life-changing surgery on a poor village girl whose fingers had been fused together from severe burns. Her family couldn't afford proper medical care, so in desperation they turned to Akrid, a child prodigy who had taught himself medicine by reading textbooks at age 5. Despite no formal training, Akrid successfully separated her fingers, restoring the use of her hand. He later entered college at age 12 and now works as a medical researcher driven by his mission to cure cancer. Morbid Facts, Part 465. In the mid-2000s, Giancarlo Esposito was forced to declare bankruptcy since his acting career was failing. The father of 4 then considered hiring a hitman to murder him to provide the insurance money for his family. But shortly afterwards, he landed the role of Gus Fring on Breaking Bad, which completely turned his life around. In 2010, 2 women tried to smuggle their dead relative's body onto a flight by putting him in a wheelchair and giving him sunglasses. They were apparently trying to save the $3,000 it would have cost them to send his body back home. In 2014, single mother Sarah Sands discovered that her 77-year-old neighbor had sexually abused her 3 sons. When authorities allowed him to return to his nearby apartment, she murdered him by stabbing him 8 times with a 12-inch blade. It was later revealed that he'd been living under a fake identity after 24 previous convictions for sex offenses that spanned over 3 decades. Sarah ended up serving 4 years in prison for the murder.